This is Dream Power Radio, the place where your dreams turn into reality. Here is your host, Debbie Spector-Weissman.
Hello, and welcome to Dream Power Radio. I'm your host, certified dream life coach, Debbie Spector-Weissman. This is a show where we talk about dreams, both daytime and nighttime dreams, and how you can use them to make the internal shift to a life you love and rediscover the truth of who you really are. A program such as Dream Power Radio would have been pretty much unthinkable before my lifetime. Ideas such as those promoted on this show, things like the power of dreams, the role of mindset, and the rewriting of your stories to create what I like to call your dream life, were for many years considered at best woo-woo, or more likely thought by many to be simply crazy. But in the past several generations, a revolution of sorts has occurred. More and more people have begun to accept the idea that we have the ability to choose how we live our lives, and that when we open ourselves up to our awareness, we can see the countless possibilities in front of us that we might otherwise not notice. The funny thing is, though, these ideas aren't new. They're concepts and beliefs that go back thousands and thousands of years. This is something my special guest, philosopher, historian, and author Peter Canova, knows all too well. In his multiple award-winning series First Soul Trilogy and the award-winning book Quantum Spirituality, Peter notes how this ancient wisdom explains humanity's purpose and also offers practical tools for us to create our own realities now. Welcome to Dream Power Radio, Peter.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Oh, it is my pleasure. Well, Peter, you've written about the ancient sect called the Gnostics and the historical ideas that they represent. Who were they, and what are some of those main beliefs that they sought to teach?
Well, the Gnostics were really both a pagan and Christian sect. They originally started off as what I would call Judeo-Christian pagans. I say that because pretty much Gnostic ideas carried over into Christianity, and they were very much related to Kabbalistic Judaism at an earlier stage. So Gnostics went through some kind of an evolution. They started off, as you would call, more pagan Gnosticism, but they became amongst the first Christians because when Jesus of Nazareth started his ministry, they saw that he was teaching a Gnostic message. And so they became amongst the first Christians, unfortunately, later on to be expunged by the Roman Catholic Church as it became a little bit more hierarchical and dogmatic. And the reason for that really gets into what I would call their core belief. There were two streams of Christianity very early on. The Gnostic Christianity represented the inner mystical church. The Orthodox Catholic Church was the outer church that developed into the church of hierarchy and dogma and so forth. But for several centuries, they coexisted. And the main difference between them was that in the Judeo-Christian conception, which we still have today, we are separate creations from the supreme source, God, the deity, give it any name you want. It's all the same thing. We're separate sources, separate creations of God, kind of like the way Geppetto created Pinocchio, right? I mean, Geppetto was the creator, Pinocchio was the creation, and there was definitely a distinction between the two of them. And oh, by the way, we did something with original sin and we ticked God off, and now we're forever trying to get back into his good graces. And it's a pretty lowly conception of human beings as these sinners forever trying to catch up in the game of life. Well, the Gnostics said, no, it's not that way at all. We are not creations. God created nothing. God projected us. God emanated us, which means that we are actually part and parcel. We are of the same consciousness as that which projected us, albeit in a much more limited state, a limited frequency or a limited vibration. But that thread going all the way back to the source is inherent in each of us. And the reason for the limitation is basically the price we pay for individuality. If we didn't have a limited conception of ourselves and thought of ourselves as ourself, and we had that higher awareness that, no, wait a minute, we're really one with the source, well, we would kind of be back in the source, and we wouldn't really be thinking of ourselves very much as individuals. So, we are those spirits that became souls. And the difference is spirits really kind of stayed within the harmony and the orbit of God's will, whereas souls kind of went off to explore the universe on their own and create their own story. And, that's been both good and bad. But anyway, that's really the viewpoint that the Gnostics have, which distinguished them from mainstream Christianity or Judaism.
And would you also say that one of the other distinctions is that they were more about the concept of love, whereas the Orthodoxy was more about fear?
Well, I do think that there's some truth to that, because obviously having a conception that we are connected to the source, there's a more intimate connection there. There's a more potential and possibility for humanity. And the Gnostic conception of God was good. Evil arises when we stray far enough from the source and forget really where we were from, that we fall into egoistic types of behavior, which are sometimes not loving and sometimes really not, very beneficial to humanity as a whole. And the way I liken it to people to understand is, if you can picture a beautiful, pure stream up in the mountains, a lake in the mountains, and this lake kind of flows down the mountain in a waterfall, at the top, it's pure. As it flows down the side of that mountain, it gathers more impurities. And so when you get down the bottom, it gets kind of muddy, but it all comes from the same source, right? But the source remains pure at the highest levels. It gets a little bit more corrupted down at the lower levels. And that's kind of how we operate. We are certainly connected to this source, but we're sort of connected in a diluted and kind of corrupted form, which, we can perfect. We can reverse engineer and work our way back up to that lake, but that's where it takes a little bit of effort on our part.
Well, as a practical sense, what does it mean to be connected to the source? I mean, how is a way for us to live our lives so that that connection is meaningful?
Right. There's the trick. Well, I think the first thing is you have to work at it. It's spirit. Developing your spiritual self or going on your spiritual path is just like any other form of work. You have to apply yourself and you have to have motivation. And see, that's the problem with most people. Most people just don't have the motivation because they've kind of given up already. God or the source or whatever is something abstract. And then, of course, you've had the rise of scientific materialism, which has been just as destructive as Orthodox Christianity in its own sense, because scientific materialism says, oh, God, there's no such thing as God. It's all what we make of it. And it's all here and now. And that's it. There's nothing beyond this. And that to me is a very destructive way of thinking, because it deviates us from a path of discovery, which otherwise could be really beneficial to us. So if you're asking for the practical ways that happens, well, I think that it varies for every person. I mean, I was very fortunate in the sense that I had kind of a spontaneous awakening and started experiencing all kinds of spiritual phenomena. And I don't know why. I don't know why that was my path. Other people have to hit rock bottom. It could be they're alcoholics, they're on drugs, their lives are just gone down the drain. And they get to the point where they just can't take it anymore. And they're either going to check out or they're going to say, there's got to be a better way than this. Now, some people will turn to things like evangelical Christianity, born again Christianity. Other people will embark on a more spiritual path. I don't knock anybody that turns to evangelical Christianity, because it's certainly better than being a drug addict. Although I do think that it has its limitations, because when you go that route, the message is, okay, we've got everything here in our little box and don't stray from our box, and we'll provide you with answers. Whereas spirituality is an open-ended process. If you look at it as a journey or a path, the religions will have you stop at their way station and say, we've got the answers here, but you got to stay in our box. Whereas spirituality will be an open-ended thing. You go in the front door and you take what you can and you go out the back door onto the way station. So in other words, it's open-ended because you don't get all the truth from any one source. Truth is a process of growing. And sometimes what you think is the truth is superseded by higher knowledge or higher truth. And that's a spiritual path. You keep yourself open to the fact that there's always something new to learn.
Yeah, and one of the things about, let's say, orthodoxy of religion is that it does keep certain things as what they say truths, and other things they sort of has discounted. And one of the ways that they've done this is in the role of women. Gnostics held women in high esteem, but women were actually in many ways written out of the Bible. So why do you think that happened?
Yeah, well, that most definitely did happen. The early leaders of the Christian movement, which incidentally, early Christianity was not called Christianity. If you went back to the very earliest roots of Christianity and you spoke to so-called Christians, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They were followers of the way. Now, the way sounds like a spiritual path. It sounds like yoga. It sounds Eastern. It's because it was a spiritual path, and that's what Jesus was teaching. He was teaching a path to spiritual awareness, and it was only taught in an oral tradition to certain people. The reason why the church divided into two streams was because the belief back then was that these sacred traditions could not be taught to the masses because they would not understand them and they would become corrupted and bastardized. As it turns out, that's kind of what happened anyway. But we know very clearly from the Bible itself and from the writings of the early church fathers that there was an inner mystical teaching, and then there was an outer teaching of the parables for the masses and so forth. So women were very much in the leadership roles, and I suspect it's because, generally speaking, women are more intuitive than men are. I mean, that's not always the case, but to a large extent it is that the women approach things more from the heart and from intuition than from the head and from logic. And you had Mary Magdalene and at least 6 other female disciples who were very prominent, but kind of written out of history. And one of the reasons that happened is that when the church was being persecuted by the Roman Empire, they were thinking, well, there's a lot of competing religions in the Roman Empire, and if we can get adopted as the state religion, then things will be a lot better for us. So essentially, they were competing amongst several other religions at the time to be adopted as the state religion of Rome. Well, the problem there was with so many females in leadership roles and the society that back then being so patriarchal amongst the Greeks, amongst the Romans, even amongst the Hebrews themselves, they were all very solidly patriarchal societies. Having so many women at the helm of your movement was an embarrassment. So they started slowly moving the women out and, kind of expunging them from history. And we even have physical evidence of this because I don't have a picture of it that I can show you, but in Ephesus, which was a magnificent Greco-Roman city that I actually visited, which is now, part of it became Turkey later on, but originally all of Asia Minor was Greek and then Greco-Roman. In the city of Ephesus, there was a cave above the city that they discovered, and it had a picture of St. Paul and St. Theoclia, who was also called Thecla, and they were side by side. Now, Thecla was sitting higher than Paul, which in those days would have indicated that she was more venerated than Paul was. And Paul's image was left untouched. Thecla's eyes were chipped out. And also, they were holding their fingers up, and I don't know, hopefully you can see this. This is a symbol, an ancient Christian symbol that bishops use. It was the sign of the bishop. And it's interestingly enough, you can actually see this sign in certain Buddhist representations. Okay. So there was a universal representation for this. Well, Thecla was holding this up along with Paul, and her eyes were chipped out and her fingers were chipped out here. And so you can see that over time, this is an actual physical reflection of how they were starting to, push women out of the major roles of the church.
And was your decision to make one of the central characters in your trilogy a female pope sort of a way to amend this historical tragedy?
She was a figure. I don't want to give away too much of the storyline here, but she was a figure returned from biblical times to get the message across that she wasn't able to do in her age. And it's a very touching story. Pope Annalisa won, I think, 10 awards in the trilogy itself, which traces the lives over these different figures over different epochs of history, won like 25 national and international awards. And it's a very moving story about how these souls struggled throughout different points of history to find their way back home and to lead humanity back to the home from which we came from, the conscious origins of which we came from. And yes, so it certainly was, using a female was certainly part of trying to restore the feminine spiritual legacy, which I think is happening anyway. I think that the intuition, working from the heart and things like that, I think is something that is a social phenomenon. I see it happening all over the place. I remember years ago, like 15, 20 years ago, I used to go to these things like Conscious Life Expo and everything. And I'd go there and there'd be like 300 women and me. Okay. And now if you go to these things, it's about 50-50. And I think that intuition is being more accepted. I think it's making inroads via the whole idea of consciousness and how consciousness operates even in scientific circles, because we have two things we're operating against here: orthodox religion and orthodox science, which are both equally harmful. Or science has its own orthodoxy, which is ironic because science cut down religion, but now it has an orthodoxy of its own. But that's being undermined. The whole idea that we were just a bunch of random cells that became from inorganic to organic and then gradually merged in more complexity and formed a human being. It doesn't hold up. It has no scientific basis to it. It's never been proved, and it makes no sense. The thing that makes much more sense is that life was a top-down rather than bottom-up process where consciousness projected what we see as reality now. And it just answers so many more questions, even eliminates so many scientific paradoxes when you adopt that viewpoint, that there's a growing movement in scientific circles now, panpsychism amongst them, which recognizes that degrees of consciousness are present in everything. And I carry that even further in my book, Quantum Spirituality, where I'm saying that conscious energy expresses itself in the form of light and subatomic particles, which carry intelligent direction the same way the DNA carries the direction that forms our body, that the consciousness embodied in light has its own form of like DNA or information. And this is another theory coming up now, information theory, that the information embodied in light is literally the DNA of reality, the DNA of the universe.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And we're going to get into that a bit more, but we do have to take a short break here. We are speaking about consciousness and ancient wisdom with author Peter Canova, and we'll be right back. I hope you're enjoying the powerful insights I bring you every week on Dream Power Radio. Now, there's a way to get more. Sign up to be a subscriber. You'll get sneak previews of upcoming shows, exclusive access to material not heard on the podcast, and special giveaways designed to uplift your dreaming life. Become a Dream Power Radio subscriber today. Sign up now by clicking on the Support the Show link in the show notes.
Welcome back to Dream Power Radio with your host, Debbie Spector-Weissman.
Yes, welcome back to Dream Power Radio. I'm your host, Debbie Spector-Weissman, and we're talking about consciousness and wisdom with Peter Canova. Well, Peter, you were just talking about the role of consciousness and energy, and you're actually saying that created life as opposed to life happening from other directions. Can you just elaborate on it a bit more?
Yeah, essentially, if you understand that the source that created everything is intelligent, it would have to be in order to create anything. And that intelligence expresses itself energetically, expresses itself through energy. And what do we experience as energy in this world? Well, primarily photons of light and other subatomic particles. Because without light, there would be no reality. I mean, the fact that you and I can see and observe each other and think that we're in a three-dimensional world is all about photons of light bouncing off of things and reflecting back into the cones and rods of our eyes, which register as impressions in the back of our brain. So in reality, we don't really know what's out there. There may be no objective reality out there. What we experience as reality all happens as a matter of consciousness expressed in the dark recesses of our brains that could simply be reading electromagnetic codes. Now, you can accept that or not accept that, but one thing that we have to accept, that even science accepts, is that in order for us to experience reality, there has to be light. The stars that you see up in the sky at night, what you're looking at is not the way they are now. You're looking at them the way they were billions of years ago, because that's how long it takes the light to reach our eyes. So we have to have light in order to see, experience, and have the sense of reality. I think almost everybody, even scientists, can agree to that much. I'm carrying it a step further, and what I'm saying is that within light and subatomic particles, that we have instructions, we have information, and information is another rising branch of science, information theory. And scientists more and more are starting to talk about reality as systems of information, as algorithms, essentially, of information, which form the basis of everything we know, the multiplicity of everything we know, the sky, the dogs, the cats, the earth, and everything else are different forms of algorithmic information that create these things. And our minds are essentially receptacles of seeing these and experiencing, what we consider reality. So that's my view of reality. I also think that it's becoming more widely accepted in scientific circles, maybe amongst a minority right now, but I think it's going to be at one point in time, I think it's going to be a majority, because science has never been able to really cope with what they call the hard problem. Now, if you talk to scientists about consciousness, that's what they term consciousness, the hard problem. And they call it the hard problem because they don't understand it. They can't figure it out. In fact, scientists don't even know what energy is. They can manipulate it, but they have no idea where it comes from, and they have no idea what it is. So these ideas that we have about the role of energy, about the role of information, and how they mix in with reality really seem to explain existence in a lot more precise and understandable manner than groping around trying to say, well, somehow inorganic matter became organic. How'd that happen? They can't tell you because it didn't happen. I mean, it's all a smoke and mirror thing for scientific materialism not to deal with the hard problem of God or consciousness.
And that makes a good story as opposed to trying to really delve into the whole idea of consciousness and really what it means and how we work with it. Another area where this comes into play is the whole idea of dream work, which deals with our unconscious mind when we're sleeping. And that whole idea of dreams having anything to say to us was also an idea that was repressed for hundreds of years. But we do now have scientific and anecdotal evidence about how dreams can shape our reality. So how do you see the role of our dreams?
Well, I think the nexus here is dreams and consciousness. Dreams are just a form of consciousness. Now, in order for us to think of ourselves as material beings in a material world, we operate under an altered form of consciousness, because at higher levels of consciousness, we know that's not true. We know we live in a matrix. We know we live in an illusion. And in fact, we can get into this. It's a whole nother topic. I don't know if we have time, but there's scientific evidence out there that we do live in a holographic matrix. So in a sense, we are like, okay, there was a Star Trek, The Next Generation, one of the Star Trek series. They had something called the holodeck on board, where the crew members would go down and they would program an experience. It could be ancient Greece, it could be the Middle Ages, whatever. And it was so real and vivid that they could actually kind of project themselves into it and interrelate with the characters and everything else. Now, we're kind of like that. We just forgot that we're the programmers and we think we're part of the program. And at a certain level of consciousness, we are certainly projecting ourselves into like a dream of reality. And the way this works is the best way to think of this is if you think of the source consciousness like a power grid, and the source consciousness is, the power source. And in order to be useful in our households and our businesses and everything else, it has to go through a series of transformers and relay stations in order to be stepped down in energy, limited down, stepped down, in order to become actually useful and on a practical basis. Well, we're kind of the same way in terms of consciousness. You look at the source as the powerhouse of energy. We're like those relay stations that operate on a limited basis. So we are part of the stream that projects reality, even though at a much more diluted level. So that new age thing, and I'm not big on a lot of new agey, kind of things. I think they get a little bit out there, but that the whole idea about manifesting has some basis to it, because we most certainly are part of the conscious stream of energy that projects itself down into what we call reality. And that whole idea of projecting consciousness down from a higher level is sort of where dreams come from. Because I think when we dream, we push our conscious mind aside, and our unconscious starts to become our conscious at that point. Okay. The higher self, and we often talk about talking to entities or contacting entities. Well, to a large extent, we're contacting our own selves at a higher level of being, because we're creatures of multiple existence, where we live in a multiverse, in a multiplicity. And in a lot of ways, we're getting answers from ourselves. So in dreams, I think, it's your own self talking to you to a large extent. Only when you're sleeping and the conscious mind is lulled, you can start to hear the messages from your subconscious and your unconscious, which during your waking time, you wouldn't even be aware of.
Oh yeah, that is something I preach all the time, that we have the ability to solve our own problems. We know the answers, that we just have to be aware enough to realize that we have those answers within us.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, I think all of life is not so much a matter of learning as much a matter of remembrance, what we already know.
That's certainly to be said. Another way that you talk about accessing the power of the unconscious mind is through meditation. Meditation can be done in very different ways, different methods. Is there a way that you find meditation, the best way that you find to use meditation to gain access to our unconscious mind?
Well, interestingly enough, you get to a point where I don't even think you have to meditate. I mean, a lot of the insights I had that were incorporated in my books, which later proved out to be validated by geopolitical circumstances, like they did an article on Pope Annalisa on how many political and social events it actually predicted over the course of time. I got all those in my waking conscious because at some point I found out the information was bleeding through and I didn't have to meditate anymore. However, I did start off by meditating, and I do encourage people to meditate, because the whole purpose of meditation is to try and still your conscious mind so that you can get higher sources of information from what you would call your subconscious or your unconscious, or, whatever you want to call it, wherever it comes from. And meditation certainly is a tried and true technique, which I encourage everybody to engage in. And there, again, you can't really pin meditation down to one way or another, because there is no one way. But I would say, generally speaking, in the book Quantum Spirituality, I go over about a dozen different factors that can help people in their meditative practice. Things like visualization, imagination, expectation, gratitude. There's about a dozen things in there that if you practice, it will really accelerate, it'll kind of turbocharge your meditation. But how you do this, it can vary from individual to individual. So for instance, some people, like in Eastern traditions, meditation is often passive. You just sort of still yourself, and sometimes things will come to you. I engage more in what I would call active meditation, where I set an intent before I go into the meditation for something that I want to understand or achieve or accomplish. And I try to visualize circumstances, almost like run my head through a movie, like whatever I'm looking for has already been accomplished. And that's a big thing. Don't pray. Prayer doesn't work. When you try and implore God and say, "Oh, gee, if you do this for me, I'll be like this. I'll be good." That doesn't work. You don't petition God, or you don't petition the source. You visualize the end result of what you want as if it's already been accomplished. And you try and you work yourself into the emotional state of feeling what it would be like to have your goal accomplished. And you lead the process. You don't follow the process or beg the process. The more you lead the process and you instill in your mind that which I'm seeking, I've already really achieved at some level. It's just waiting to fulfill itself at this level. It's been fulfilled at a higher level. Now I'm waiting to fulfill itself at this level. That works. Okay. And the more emotion you put into it, emotion is very key. The more emotion and desire you put into it, the closer you become to achieving it. But, again, you can do the Eastern meditation in a more passive way, or you can try, active meditation. It depends on each person.
Yes. And it's wonderful that we have the ability to choose the one that will work best for us, because we all are different, like you say. Peter, how can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, the best thing to do is go to my website, petercanova.com. That's petercanova.com. There's portals there that go to Quantum Spirituality, that go to the Trilogy, and that go to my own podcast called Quantum Spirituality. You can find articles and videos that are very educational on there. It's really a wealth of information, and I encourage everybody to go there. Even if you don't buy anything, you'll certainly learn something. So check it out.
Okay, well, Peter, thank you so much for being on Dream Power Radio today.
Good to be with you.
We've been speaking about ancient wisdom and consciousness with Peter Canova. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. If so, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Until next time, this is Debbie Spector-Weissman saying, sweet dreams, everybody.
You've been listening to Dream Power Radio with your host, Debbie Spector Weissman. For more information on Debbie or to sign up for her newsletter, go to dreampowerradio.com. This has been Dream Power Radio.